Native American boarding schools were off-reservation schools created during the late 19th century with the goal of suppressing Native American traditions and culture in American Indian students. The Indian Civilization Act had the goal of promoting the quote-unquote civilization of Native American tribes by encouraging education and the adoption of Euro-American customs at the time. It was enacted by the U.S. Congress in 1819, authorizing funding for many religious societies, such as Christian missionaries, to establish schools aimed at educating specifically Native Americans. Carlisle Industrial School was founded in 1879. It was founded by a U.S. Army officer named Richard Henry Pratt. As its longtime superintendent, he ran the school with the goal of kill the Indian, save the man in mind. After the creation of Carlisle, others followed, and more than 523 boarding schools, government-funded and often church-run, were in the United States in the 19th and 20th centuries. Other schools include Moqui Indian School, Forest Grove Indian Training School, and Chemoa Indian School.
Native American children were forcibly removed from their homes as part of the U.S. federal policies in the 19th and early 20th centuries, aimed at assimilating them into Euro American culture. This was done through the establishment of these boarding schools. Schools such as those run by the Bureau of Indian Affairs and religious organizations. The system began in earnest in the late 1800s with institutions like the Carlisle Indian Industrial School in Pennsylvania becoming a model for these efforts. In these schools, boys were trained in manual labor skills such as farming, carpentry, and blacksmithing, while girls were taught domestic skills such as sewing, cooking, and housekeeping. These students often worked long hours in the fields, workshops, or kitchens, essentially performing unpaid labor. The curriculum at these schools was specifically designed to erase Native American identities and replace them with Euro American norms. These children suffered a great deal. Children were prohibited from speaking their native languages and wearing native clothing or hairstyles. Their names would often be replaced with Western style English names, and more often than not, violations of these practices would lead to strict punishments like physical beatings or isolation. Girls' classes were structured to enforce gender specific roles as seen by the Euro American ideals of femininity and domesticity. The curriculum for girls focused on preparing them for lives as housewives or domestic workers, rather than providing a broad academic education. In these boarding schools, shoemaking was one of the vocational skills taught to boys as part of the school's goal to assimilate them into Euro American society and prepare them for manual labor jobs. Shoemaking classes were structured to teach practical skills, but they often involved exploitative labor practices that prioritized the needs of the schools over the education of the children. These students were required to wear uniforms that adhered to Euro American standards of dress, erasing their cultural identity and forcing assimilation. The clothing was often plain, utilitarian, and designed to strip away individuality and cultural expression. Football teams in the boarding schools played a unique and complex role within the assimilationist agenda. While the boarding schools sought to suppress Native identities and culture, sports became a space where these students could excel, find camaraderie, and in some cases, subtly challenge the stereotypes and constraints imposed upon them.
While the federal government felt a responsibility to take the Indian out of the man, the basic human rights and ones stated by the Constitution were horribly disregarded for the Indian children and continued to affect their identity and, most importantly, their psychological and cultural state in the present. Students were forced to cut their hair and give up their traditional clothing. They had to give up their meaningful native names and take English ones. They were not only taught to speak English, but were punished for speaking their own languages. Their own traditional religious practices were forcibly replaced with Christianity and were taught that their culture was inferior. These boarding schools were created to carry out ethnocide against the indigenous people and ruin the foundation of American Indian culture from past generations. Native Americans have the right to preserve and practice their spiritual beliefs, languages, and traditions, and it was a vital responsibility of the U.S. government to provide a safe and educational environment for their students, regardless of their cultural background.
Many of these practices go against the rights of the Constitution. These practices go against the First Amendment due to the Native Americans being prohibited from speaking their language and partaking in their spiritual practices. It also violated the 14th Amendment because the children were forcibly removed from their homes and suffered from abusive practices. This disregarded the due process and equal protection clauses of the 14th Amendment.
Despite their negative impact, others mention that the boarding schools have also positively impacted students. They help students develop relationships, a multi tribal identity, and promote sports like football and basketball. Extracurricular activities and other scholarly opportunities have helped some students prosper in the future. These schools also created a community, fostering unity and determination for the Native children to fight for their rights and culture. Additionally, the Constitution may not have explicitly protected cultural practices, allowing the government to prioritize assimilation policies.
The argument that the boarding schools aim to promote a well rounded education ignores the systemic abuse, cultural erasure, and lasting trauma on Native children, which far outweighed any purported benefits. While the Constitution may not have explicitly protected cultural practices, the First Amendment guarantees freedom of religion and expression, rights that were blatantly violated in these schools. Children were taken miles away from home, where they were abused and reprimanded, starved, and banned from doing anything that may constitute as representation of their cultural practices. They were stripped of their traditional clothing, hair, and personal belongings that may have represented their culture. This left many children distraught, with many who also never got to see their families again. According to the Equal Justice Initiative, researchers have confirmed that at least 973, or even more than 2,000 from other sources, Indigenous children died in these boarding schools, operated or supported by the federal government. It is unclear about the cause of deaths, but reports say that some included disease and abuse. Those who did survive still have to struggle with trauma and lasting effects on physical and mental health.
The forced suppression of Native American culture in U.S. federal boarding schools led to the loss of traditions, languages, and spiritual beliefs, adversely impacting the physical and mental health of individuals and violating their human rights, with enduring effects on future generations.
Native American boarding schools violated tribal sovereignty and Native rights by imposing assimilation policies that disrupted cultural and familial connections. The federal government failed its responsibility to protect Native rights and instead imposed assimilation policies that disregarded constitutional protections like freedom of religion and due process. This led to ongoing advocacy against historical injustices by current Native American generations, with support from other organizations and society.